Who are we? Well, we're Delmarva Conservative Movement. How did we get here? It started out as a group of ladies, some of whom were school teachers, and they kind of got together and were talking about how they couldn't get together and talk with some other folks because they weren't quite as conservative as we are. So then they invited their husbands and their friends, and here we are. Now we have a core group of maybe 20 to 25 people, probably 250 plus people following us on Facebook, and we're trying to affect some change here in the community. How are we doing that? Our mission statement. One moment. Don't laugh, you young people, you'll get here soon. Our mission: attract, preserve, present, and represent conservative values, morals, and mores through unity, fellowship, leadership, community involvement, education, political activism, and philanthropy under God. So, I'd like to get started tonight with the Pledge of Allegiance, if you would all stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Hunter Diskin, would you come up for the prayer? So, our forum tonight is going to be question and answer. Each candidate will be given a question. They'll have 3 minutes to answer. The second candidate to go will have 3 minutes to answer the same question, and then that person will go first on the next question. Before we do that, the candidates are going to give them a brief introduction of themselves. So, Ms. Dykes, if you would, ladies first.
Please don't afford me courtesy that way. I'm going to try and speak without the microphone. If anybody has trouble hearing, please raise your hand, okay? So, good evening. Much thanks to the Delmarva Conservative Movement for having me here tonight, so that you can have quality information from which to make this important decision, as all your voting decisions will be this election. I have prepared packets for you for pickup at the end of tonight. So I hope that will help you factually determine, sift the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So if there aren't copies enough to go around, I'll leave a legal pad. Leave me your email address and I'll send those to you. I recognize many familiar faces, but for those who don't know me, I'm Jamie Dykes, and I'm your state's attorney here in Wicomico County. Many of you know my tenacity, my drive to bring the best of me to my work and to this community every day. I was appointed by the Circuit Court bench on December 1st of 2017. I won the election by a 19-point margin in November of 2018. I've served the last 4.5 years, meeting challenges, most of which many elected prosecutors will never encounter. I've done so meeting my ethical obligations and with the best interest of this community in mind. What sets me apart? My unwavering commitment to this community since I was the young child of a volunteer firefighter and a volunteer EMS provider. I became a cadet at the Parsonsburg Fire Company at 13, an EMT at 16, and I have served my community since. I've been committed to this position without fail since I took office. What sets me apart? My experience and my track record. As a line prosecutor, I have personally prosecuted more than 100 cases to juries. I've prosecuted dozens of homicides to juries. The vast majority of those have been as sole counsel for the state or as first chair. As state's attorney, I have successfully led an incredible team to a 15-point gain in success at jury trials. I've managed a $4 million budget. My accounting degree and experience in that regard come in handy. I've worked with the county executive and the county council to increase starting salaries to attract qualified, capable prosecutors and support staff. I've created the first of its kind prosecution integrity unit and the LEAD program, which is a law enforcement officer assisted diversion program executed in the city. And currently, as we speak, I am working with the Pittsville Police Chief and the Sheriff's Office. I've spoken to the director of the Eastern Shore Criminal Justice Academy about developing an ICAT program, Integrated Communications Assessment and Tactics. It's a use of force protocol that fills a gap on how to respond to volatile situations in which no firearms are present. In fact, I'm traveling tomorrow with the chief of Fruitland Police and 2 sheriff's deputies to New Jersey to explore those possibilities. I've created a team structure the first day I took office to ensure that our solemn obligations are met, ensuring that mentorship for young prosecutors happens in a meaningful way, and ensures consistency, fairness, and competency in case preparation and resolution. Under my leadership, we have used innovative, complex, investigative techniques to solve cold case murders, and we will continue to use oh my goodness. We will continue to use all the resources available to us. I've hired capable and strong prosecutors, investigators, victim witness coordinators, and staff who are not ego-driven, they are mission-driven. Our conviction rate, I've already indicated, has increased by 15 points. What sets me apart? Integrity and fortitude. Meeting unprecedented challenges, the Salisbury Police Department's property room, a theft of $250,000. As a result of that discovery, that led to efforts by 3 law enforcement officers to hide exculpatory evidence. And a former assistant state's attorney became aware of those efforts, detailed those in a memorandum, and secreted them. Failed to disclose for 9 years that information. There is no record that that assistant state's attorney disclosed that information to the then state's attorney, which would have been the protocol. As a result of that assistant state's attorney's conduct, the state's attorney's office for Wicomico County failed to meet its obligations for more than 9 years in hundreds of criminal cases. My competitor chose this former prosecutor to be his treasurer. Inside the packet that you will have access to are copies of that memo. Read that for yourself and determine if you were a defendant charged in a criminal case, would you want to know that information? Because you're obligated, the state is obligated to provide that information to you. What we do matters as prosecutors. It is that simple. The safety of our community hinges on its confidence in the system. I met my solemn obligations as a prosecutor, and I have been criticized for that because it suits a particular agenda. If that agenda succeeds, there will be an incredible cost to public safety in Wicomico County. Am I out of time?
A little over. So
Okay. Okay, thank you, thank you. My competitor has made all manner and sort of claims against my office, my staff, and my prosecutors. Those claims simply are not true. Law enforcement trusts me to make hard decisions. I have the endorsements of, again, they're in your packet, of the Maryland Troopers Association, Chief Swafford, formerly recently retired from the Fruitland Police Department, former Chief Hal Saylor of the Del Mar Police Department, Sheriff Joe Gamble of Talbot County, who is hands down, no offense to any other investigators, the best homicide detective I have ever worked with. And I have the support of Sheriff Lewis, who I appreciate appearing tonight. So at that, I will leave it. Thank you, Mr. Cook.
How much time, Madam? So, because Ms. Dykes went over, we're going to give you the extra time as well.
I'm going to try and
take
go
time.
without the mic as well and see. We'll see how that
We'll
works.
turn it off. How's that?
So my name is Lee Britt. I'm running for state's attorney for a very simple reason. I want to rebuild the trust and communication that has broken down over the last 4 years between the state's attorney's office and law enforcement. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So imagine that the Salisbury Fire Department has 100 firefighters, and 85 of those firefighters over an 18-month span walk out the door. What do you think that does to the mission of the Salisbury Fire Department? It drastically impacts the ability of that department, of that agency, to fulfill its mission. It doesn't stop there. Imagine that of all of the 85 people hired to replace those who had just left, of those, another 35 people also walk out the door. That is a picture of what has occurred in the state's attorney's office over the last 4 years. Now, in any agency, we expect some turnover. In any agency, we expect people to resign, to be fired, to retire. Life happens, right? People move on. But when you have a 125% plus turnover rate among the attorney staff, that has a dramatic impact on the agency's ability to fulfill its mission. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, and I encourage you to go out and find out for yourself. You know law enforcement officers. Go to the line officers. Go to the line officers at Salisbury Police Department, Fruitland, SUPD. Go to the state troopers. Go to the sheriff's deputies. Talk to the line officers about what it is they're seeing, about what it is that they're interacting with. And what you're going to hear is this, that when the police call the state's attorney's office in the middle of the night, they're standing on the side of the road, they don't know who they're talking to because they have lost a whole group of individuals who they have grown to trust, they've grown to know, and they don't know if the people who they call on the other end of that line, whether or not they can trust the opinion, the legal opinion that is provided to them in that phone call. And as we all know, as watching the news over the last several years, if the police make a misstep in any way, shape, or form, they can be in a jackpot. Their lives can be dramatically changed. They might even end up being the subject of criminal prosecution. And Ms. Dykes brought up my treasurer. I'm sorry she couldn't be here tonight. She's a great person. She's on a family vacation right now, and when we changed the date, she wasn't able to be here for this event. Let's talk a little bit about that. One thing that I am decidedly not a part of the Good Old Boy Network. I just am not. And so one of the things that concerns me about what I've seen in the state's attorney's office over the last 4 years is a disparate treatment for those in the know, for those with connections, and those who have none. And so, for example, Ms. Dykes brought up the Salisbury Police Department investigation regarding the evidence locker. There was a lot of drama made over that. There were a lot of press headlines. There was a lot of information provided. What was the outcome? What was the outcome? Did anybody hear anything about that? Because what you didn't hear was that of the 3 people whose names Ms. Dykes dragged through the mud, who she put into pleadings, of the 3 people, 1 officer resigned and the other 2 had no sanctions sustained. What was the outcome? When asked at the FOP Lodge meeting recently if she had a duty to retract statements made against people, she indicated no. She doesn't have a duty to correct the record. How about with Miss Ross? Miss Ross filed a report. She gave it to her supervisor. She gave it to a member of the Salisbury Police Department. As a young prosecutor, I think probably that was the reasonable outcome for her. And instead, Ms. Dykes filed a grievance against her. Filed a grievance trying to take her bar license. So what happens? What was the outcome of that story? Well, I'll tell you what. When somebody goes to court, or they're supposed to show up to court, and they fail to appear, what happens? A bench warrant is issued for their arrest. We take these sorts of things very seriously. But when the Attorney Grievance Commission met, and the chief complainant, Ms. Dykes, had provided this statement against Ms. Ross, what was the outcome? Well, we don't know what Ms. Dykes would have said because she never appeared. She never showed up. Trying to strip Ms. Ross of her bar license, she never bothered to show up to the Attorney Grievance Commission meeting. That's appalling. That's appalling. And then again, to stand here and deride somebody when you didn't even have the courage to show up to the Attorney Grievance Commission in the first place. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. Now, there are things that set apart Ms. Dykes and myself. You're going to hear about some of them tonight. I spent 10 years with the State's Attorney's Office. Most of that time was under Matt Massarello, who I think set the gold standard for how a State's Attorney's Office ought to be run. He was a wonderful person to work for, to work with. He's one of 3 people I consider a mentor. First would be Judge Don Davis, who I was able to clerk for when I first came to the shore back in 2008. After that was Deputy State's Attorney Sam Vincent, who showed me what it was like to be a gentleman, to do combat in the courtroom, but to do so civilly. And of course, we lost him tragically. And finally, Matt Massarello, who took time every week to walk around to his attorneys and say, how are you doing? What are you seeing? Here's what I'm seeing. What are you hearing? Here's what I'm hearing. And I can't tell you the impact that it had as a young prosecutor to have the state's attorney implement policy based on a discussion I had just had with him. He would go around and get buy-in from each of his attorneys, and he had what was said by folks in Annapolis as the single strongest state's attorney's office in the state of Maryland. And of course, of that state's attorney's office, one now remains. Now, there are good people in the state's attorney's office now, a couple of them right here in this room. And I think they're trying to do good work. But when, just like those firefighters, the 15 who are left after 85 of them walked out the door, 30 seconds. The 15 who are left, they still got to put out fires. They still got to do the work. And when you have that much turnover in such a short amount of time, it is indicative of a problem with leadership. It's indicative of a toxic culture. We deserve better, and I'm going to do better. Thanks.
Well, if you guys can talk without darn well I can. So, thank you both very much for your opening statements. We're going to get to the question and answer part now. Ms. Dykes, if you'd like to go first, what we're going to do again is we're going to alternate. You will answer first. You will have 3 minutes. My timekeeper's going to tighten things up a little bit now in the interest of time. And you'll go first. You will go second, sir. And then the next question, you will go first. Ms. Dykes will go second. So here's your question. What is your plan for public safety? Please include discussion on guns, drugs, gangs, and any other topics you see fit.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. My plan for public safety is to continue to use all available investigative techniques and to be innovative in evolving new technologies to secure convictions and to hold convicted offenders accountable, especially where violent crime is concerned. Under my leadership, we were the first to utilize a wiretap on an open homicide, an unsolved homicide, to consult and work with the FBI to obtain video enhancement and identification of the perpetrators. These techniques are not readily available through local law enforcement. It was my relationships with those entities that we were able to make those happen. The shooter in that case, Richard Brayboy, is now serving life without the possibility of parole plus 35 years. We again partnered with the FBI for video enhancement as to another unsolved shooting at the VFW. The defendant in that case, Jerry Hamilton, was convicted of attempted second-degree murder. City Police and I have discussed the use of cameras within the community, poll cameras. They are being used in other communities that see violence that our city does in identification of perpetrators and prevention and deterrence. Internally, I have focused on training and specialization of my staff to ensure that each prosecutor is well versed in the technical aspects of prosecuting specific crimes. They include the use of scientific DNA evidence, ballistics, to its maximum effect and benefit. The vast majority of crime, of our street violence, is driven by the illegal drug trade here in Wicomico County. The Wicomico County Sheriff's Office CAT team and the newly formed Wicomico Narcotics Task Force, of which we are a member, are working diligently together. The fact of the matter is that our brave and valued law enforcement officers, the men and women in blue, the tip of the spear in crime fighting, we need more of them. My office stands with them and ready to assist
30 seconds.
before prosecution even begins. My prosecutors' liaisons are assigned to agencies and regularly consulted 24/7, 365. We review every search warrant. From the time I took office, search warrant production, primarily because of the CAT team, has increased 40% in this county. I have a long and proactive prosecution view. We have to be worried about mental health, especially for our children. Their mental health needs must be met. Thank you.
Mr. Britt, would you like the question repeated?
No, thank you, sir. I don't think that's necessary. So I've touched on it a little bit. First, I want to rebuild trust and communication with law enforcement, and here's what that means. We have had recently, let me give you a real life example. Last December, Salisbury police officer goes to the Fountains for a disturbance call. While at the Fountains, while trying to effectuate an arrest, he is assaulted. There is a person charged with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. That case is brought up to circuit court. The case is pled out to disorderly conduct without bothering to call the subject officer. Let me say it again. The case is resolved without calling the police officer who's the victim of the offense. That's wrong. That's wrong. At least call the officer up to get some input, some insight as to what he would like to see happen, as to some voice. Give him voice. Merely saying communication is happening doesn't make it so. That's going to be a theme throughout the night. Merely saying something doesn't make it so. All right? Now, what is the outcome? Well, the case that was pled out to disorderly conduct, that same subject, just a week and a half ago, was involved in a melee inside of Mojo's restaurant and is currently pending charges of felony assault first degree. What would have happened if the state's attorney's office had bothered to call that police officer? Would they have been able to resolve the case to a different charge? We'll never know. And I'm not trying to second guess the prosecutor. Maybe it was a case where resisting was inappropriate and disorderly was the right one, but make the call. Call the police officer. That's common courtesy. And that's part of the issue that police are seeing repeatedly, line officers are seeing repeatedly, and members of the bar are seeing as well. Getting return calls, getting return emails is difficult. It's difficult, and it shouldn't be so. It's 2022. You don't have to send up smoke signals or flares, calls, emails, texts, any will do. But at least reach out to the police officer to let him know, hey, here's what I intend to do with this case and here's why. That didn't happen, and now we've got a gentleman who tore up mojos and is pending a felony assault.
30 seconds.
It's would not be that way in my administration.
Thank you, sir. Question number 2. Mr. Britt, you're up first this time. What is your position on bail reform? Include in your answer discussion on major and minor crimes.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple key principles. First, people are innocent until proven guilty. Any accused, any defendant, innocent until proven guilty. It is a bedrock of our criminal justice system. And so I think that the default position ought to be to release that individual unless and until they are shown to be a danger or shown to be a flight risk. If shown to be a danger, if shown to be a flight risk, then yeah, there's no condition of bond that's going to guarantee the safety of the public, guarantee the safety of the community. I think there's a big difference between, for example, that gentleman who tore up mojos and somebody who steals a Snickers bar at the Walmart. Okay, so the presumption ought to be to release those nonviolent offenders, and for folks who are either have a history of violent offenses or accusations of violent offenses, probably the solution is a no bond for those individuals. I don't think that one's too hard.
Same question.
Thank you. Certainly 2017 bail reform is here to stay. Mr. Britt has noted the standard that is cited in the rule, and that is risk of flight or public safety risk. The reality is that the court determines bond. Generally speaking, low risk, nonviolent offenders are not held until or unless they have a history of failure to appear in court. As to those who risk the community safety, violent offenders, those who deal in fentanyl and other opioids, and who illegally possess firearms, they are being held here in Wicomico County by and large, because we are grateful to have judges that care about the public safety in a way that maybe other jurisdictions don't. My prosecutors assess a defendant's entire criminal history. Someone who is on parole or probation, who has prior convictions for crimes of violence, gun convictions or ties to organized crime. We stay in contact with charging officers for their input on people they believe pose a special risk. We find if somebody's convicted of a sex offense, I'm going to want to know all the underlying details, and so do my prosecutors, so that they can make an appropriate recommendation to the court for bond considerations. Thank you.
All right, question number 3. And this is to you, Mrs. Sykes, first. What is your stance on repeat offenders? Once they are punished and pay their debt, should they still be tagged with the scarlet letter for life? Discuss both statute and your opinion. You may wish to use something like DUI and sex offenses as examples in your response.
Great and thoughtful questions, DCM. I'm not sure who is to credit for those. So. If we are going to live in a civilized society, we have to have accountability. Bottom line. Prosecutors enforce the law, we do not make it. Those who repeatedly break the law, especially those who commit the same crime repeatedly, lack respect for their fellow citizens and victims, or in the case of a DUI, potential victims. Maryland has seen fit to enhance penalties for repeat offenders as an additional deterrent. For violent crimes, on the fourth violent crime conviction, offenders can get life and have done with my office. As to sex crimes, the legislature has seen fit to impose registration and supervision some for periods of life. That ensures the public safety. I have a strong history of prosecuting sex offenses, serious sex offenses. It's important for me that the public know, the community know, a sex offender's history, have the opportunity to protect themselves and their family. That's my answer. Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir. I think it's just a simple fact of life that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so if you have Uncle Charlie, who every time he comes over for Thanksgiving dinner, he steals silverware, you're going to stop inviting him to Thanksgiving dinner, okay? It's a similar thing with respect to criminal history. I'm a big believer in second chances. I'm a big believer that folks should have an opportunity, in most circumstances, to try to get their life right. It is hard for some folks to do that, those who are suffering from drug addictions, those who have sexual addictions, and we see that those folks recidivate at a much higher percentage. So I think it is only proper, it's only proper that we have subsequent offender penalties available for those types of offenders, that we keep tabs on, especially sex offenders. But I'm a big believer that somebody who has gone, because listen, we were all young and stupid once, right? We all did things probably that we ought not to have done when we were 14, 15, 16 last week, who knows? But for somebody, like I have a client right now who, when he was a juvenile 20 years ago, went on a malicious destruction rampage, breaking out windows, spray painting, things of that sort. And he racked up 3 or 4 criminal convictions, tons of restitution, and that's followed him well into his adulthood. So now he's 25 years post that event, has led an exemplary life, a businessman, a husband, a father. Should that continue to follow him, or should there be some grace? Our legislature has recently, in the last several years, opened up paths for expungement for those types of offenses. And I'm talking about for those types of offenses. Very, very differently are those on the other side of the equation. Crimes of violence. I don't know if it's a scarlet letter or not, but there are such offenses in this world that if you commit them, they ought to follow you for the rest of your life. They ought to be considered every time that you are arrested, every time there is a bail decision, every time there is a plea offer made, every time there is a sentence imposed. And it is only proper that sentences of that sort, for example, robbery, armed robbery,
30 seconds.
it is only proper that those sentences be proper and that those convictions follow you until the end of your days. So I think there's a vast difference between nonviolent offenses and serious violent crimes and sexual predators.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Britt, this one's to you first. In light of the death of Deputy Glenn Hilliard, how will you address crimes against police officers? And in light of some of the things we've heard this evening, and to make the question a little more challenging, also discuss how you will address crimes committed by police officers.
So, I indicated I spent the vast majority of my time as a prosecutor under Matt Massarello. And while I was working for Matt, I had the discretion, I had the authority to find cases that I thought needed special attention. And for those who don't know, we have 2 trial level courts in Maryland. We've got the district court and circuit court. District court handles the vast majority of cases, but they tend to be less serious in nature. Circuit court is where we try our jury trial level, felony level offenses. And a lot of times things can get lost in the district court just because of the sheer volume of cases that are going. I mean, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the judges are under an onslaught of cases. So every time I would find a resisting arrest case, a physical resisting arrest case, assault on law enforcement, that I thought needed some special attention, I would bring that upstairs and bring that up into the circuit court and address it there. Because if a person is willing to assault a law enforcement officer, if they're willing to attack somebody who is supposed to be the vision of law and order, then that means they have absolutely no consideration for anyone else. absolutely no consideration for anyone else. And so I think that crimes against law enforcement officers need to absolutely be taken seriously. And just like this case I was talking about earlier, we need to have interaction with law enforcement officers about when they are the victim of an assault, when they are the victim of a resisting arrest, what do they want to see happen in that particular case. As to your kind of trick addition question, there are, just like in anything in the world, there are bad priests, there are bad cops, there are bad baseball players, and thankfully there's a very small percentage of those folks. But when we come up against a law enforcement officer who is in fact committing criminal offenses, fraud, abuse, I think they ought to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law as well, because they ought to be the paragon of virtue, right? We expect them to be a step above the rest of us mere mortals. There's nothing that can bring a fallen officer back, but what we can do is have faith for their brethren and to treat their brothers and sisters who still are on the job, treat them well, treat them properly, and prosecute the folks who are going to be disrespectful to them and take that disrespect to abuse, assault, resisting, and other forms of violence.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Dykes.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Over the past 3 to 4 years, we've seen a rise in crimes committed against law enforcement officers and first responders and medical providers in hospital settings, and a rise in those people interfering with law enforcement officers attempting to effect arrests. Every assault on a law enforcement officer, first responder, medical provider that's charged in Wicomico County is reviewed by a circuit court prosecutor for whether that case is appropriate to bring to the circuit court or not. Whether it can be fairly and justly dealt with in the district court depends on the facts and circumstances of each and every case. We will continue to take crime, especially violent crime, seriously, and assaultive crime. Frankly, far too many young people are involved in the sale of illegal drugs, as in Hilliard's murderer. Far too many people, young people, are possessing and using guns. Far too many young people have no respect for the life of others. And we see far too many crimes committed against our police officers who selflessly serve. Integrity at every stage of prosecution, at every stage. Setting a high standard and holding prosecutors accountable to that high standard is the best way to ensure public safety. I've met those standards for my office, and I will continue to do so, honoring the work of our partners in law enforcement in hopes of avoiding another tragedy. We have seen far too many as of late. As to Mr. Britt's claim as to the disorderly conduct, I would be surprised. I would be surprised if that prosecutor did not reach out to that law enforcement officer, but I will certainly find out. That is unlike the assigned prosecutor in that case. Maybe she sent an email, maybe she didn't call. I'm not sure if we're parsing words here, but I will certainly find out. Crimes committed by police officers. In my 15 years,
30 seconds.
I have, thank you. I have prosecuted 2 police officers for abuses of power and sent them to prison. And I've prosecuted 1 correctional officer. He wasn't sent to prison, but all 3 of them abused their power. And I will send however many more need to be. But in my experience, that is not reflective of our law enforcement community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dykes. Sorry for the trick question, guys, but in conversation, you guys actually brought it up, so.
Keeping us on our toes.
I like to make things difficult once in a while. It's my nature.
It's good to know ourselves.
Know thy limitations. Okay, number 5. Comment on the state mandated police accountability boards include who should be on such boards? What changes would you make?
Okay,
Mrs. Dykes.
thank you. I've been very clear. I don't believe that police accountability boards are necessary in Wicomico County. Annapolis saw fit otherwise, and we will, as the county executive has done, follow the law. I have been consulted while my office plays no role in the selection or the implementation of police accountability boards, but I appreciate the county executive consulting me on that. Over the years, I've had less than a dozen citizens cite concerns of overreach of law enforcement to me. When I'm approached with such concerns, I say, give me the facts. I need to know when, where, who was the quote-unquote victim of such contact, and the law enforcement agency. Not one of those complainants has ever come back to me with that detailed information. I imagine that our police accountability board will have the same fate, in that people will be unwilling, for whatever reason, to provide those necessary details. The process, the implementation of ours, is thorough and well thought out, in my view. It ensures integrity in that there are background checks required of members. It provides for training in law enforcement matters of members, so that they can have a basic understanding of what our law enforcement face every day. And it protects the confidentiality of investigative matters. That's crucial. They will certainly be subject to having sensitive law enforcement investigative information, and we do not want disclosure to risk the safety of any person. If I were to suggest any change, I would say that decrease the length of time of the chair of the Police Accountability Board. It's required law enforcement experience of 20 years. That's a really long time. I would just say that, in my humble opinion, there is well-respected, recently retired Chief Swafford, who has 15 years of experience, and it seems to me that he has all the qualities that could make a good chair. But if that's being picky. So. Thank you.
So I am open to the general concept of the police accountability boards. I think, as Ms. Dykes has indicated, the ship sailed in terms of Annapolis dictating to all of the counties in Baltimore City that we will have them. My concern is that, like, we all go to the dentist, and if your dentist drills and fills your teeth and then has to present himself or defend himself to a dentist accountability board, that board probably is lacking in the skills, training, experience that your dentist has, and doesn't know the life of the dentist. And just merely watching, CSI Dentist is not going to fill them in on, what it is that dentists do on a day in and day out basis. So I think that at a minimum, I would expect and hope that anybody who's going to be nominated to the Police Accountability Board and partake in that would do a shoot, no shoot, would do ride-alongs, would experience training. It might be great to have them go to the training academy and go through some of the drills that law enforcement officers themselves are subjected to train themselves up, and so that they have a much better idea. Because frankly, I mean, I've been in the criminal justice system in various forms for 17 years, but one thing I've never been is a police officer. I don't have that perspective. I don't know what it is that they do. I don't see the things that they see. I see a very, very cleaned up version that comes to me in a manila folder a couple days later. So I think unless the Police Accountability Board members have that experience, have that shoot, don't shoot training, have that day in, day out training, they're not going to be really well equipped to understand what it is law enforcement is subjected to on a daily basis. So I think that's would be my hope and expectation for the Police Accountability Board.
Thank you, Mr. Britt. Ladies and gentlemen, you have the opportunity to fill out an index card on the way in if you so chose to ask any questions of our candidates. If you would like to do that still, now's the time. Or please make sure you get them to Dave Cooper over here, because we're getting ready to cut off that time. So if you have a question you want us to ask, turn it in now, please. With that said, number 6 to you, Mr. Britt. How will you address let's try that again. How will you address prosecutorial disparity based on money, status, race, gender, any other things you would like to throw into that mix?
Well, so I think it is really important that a prosecutor be a minister of justice, and it ought not matter who you are or who you know. I don't know that that's the experience that folks have had in the last 4 years. So we talked a little bit about the Salisbury Police Department experience and the experience of those officers, and they were literally dragged through the mud for months and months and months on end. Have any of you heard about any allegations of fraud with the Salisbury University Police Department, with their evidence locker? And if the answer is no, well, that's not shocking. The issue here, the issue that most people don't know about, is a similar issue presented when 3 police officers from the Salisbury University Police Department discovered that fraud was being committed by 2 of their superiors. They tried to bring that up the chain of command. They tried to bring that to the state's attorney's office. The issue is that one of the high-ranking police officers was Ms. Dyke's aunt. And when Ms. Dykes got this information, instead of farming that out immediately, she had several staff members look at it. And then after having several staff members look at it, she finally did the right thing, farmed it out, but only farmed it out to Worcester County. The state's attorney at that time in Worcester County was Billy McDermott. Billy McDermott had the case for 6 months. Exactly 0 things occurred in that 6-month period. And then, of course, Billy McDermott, after losing an election to Chris Heiser, where did he go to work? Came to work for Ms. Dykes. In the interim, Ms. Dykes' aunt initiated an investigation against those 3 whistleblowers. And in fact, those 3 whistleblowers were this close to losing their jobs. All 3 of them were the sole bread earners for their families, one of whom had a little girl going through cancer treatment. He had the sole insurance for that little girl. And they came this close to losing their job by telling truth to power, by talking about fraud at the SUPD. Ms. Heiser was elected state's attorney in Worcester County. She had the case for 6 days. In 6 days' time, she notified the relevant parties. She sent a letter to Ms. Dykes indicating that these officers likely committed fraud. This is likely Brady material. Should be disclosed.
30 seconds.
Did anybody hear anything about that? Anyone? Bueller? No. Crickets. Crickets. And when these 3 officers had their livelihoods challenged, was there any defense? Any defense from the structure here? Again, crickets. So it shouldn't matter who you know. It shouldn't matter what race, creed, religion, color, sexual orientation. It shouldn't matter. The law is the law.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, very much. I know almost nothing of what Mr. Britt indicates, almost nothing. I became aware of an incident, now Judge Dean. I signed it to her. She recommended it go to Worcester. It was sent to Worcester County. It was sent to Worcester County. Baseless. In Wicomico County, under my leadership, there simply is no prosecutorial disparity based on money, status, race, gender, or any other class, protected or otherwise. Charging decisions, case resolution decisions are made based on the admissible evidence and the law and nothing less. To do so would violate our oaths as prosecutors. During my tenure, some have taken issue with the practice and have contacted me seeking favorable treatment based on status, and some in an attempt to influence what our decisions are. I tell people about once a week in our office, our jobs are not to make people happy. In fact, nobody is usually ever happy because of contact they had with our office. It's the worst day of their lives. Our job is to enforce the law without fear or favor. What I can promise you is that there is great integrity in the way each and every case is handled in my office, each and every. Along those lines, in the packet that we will have for you, I recommend you compare my campaign finance report with those of my challenger. My funding has come from grassroots efforts, campaigning. 87% of Mr. Britt's funding has come from 3 defense attorneys and 1 former defendant, recently prosecuted by our office. Thank you.
Okay, we're on the downward stretch. Number 8. Did you get all the questions, Dave? Where'd he go? Everyone turn in their question that had one? Yes, good, okay. Number 8, police officers.
Number 7.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, excuse me, number 7. How can the Wicomico County Wicomico County State's Attorney's Office, see, that's what I get when I abbreviate. How can the Wicomico County State's Attorney's Office address the roving groups of dirt bike riders on our public streets and highways? They constitute a hazard and a nuisance. If you consider this a law enforcement issue, how can you effect change that will help alleviate this hazard on our roadways? Mrs. Dykes, you're first.
Thank you. The solution is going to be multifaceted, like most public safety issues that our community faces. The reality is that the pursuit of operators and thus the identification of them and the prosecution of them is a challenge and creates liability issues for law enforcement. Pursuit can lead to other people being injured. That's property damage in cars or people being killed. About 2 years ago, I believe it was, we had a dirt bike driver killed, and that does not seem to have been much of a deterrent to dirt bike riders. Most police agency policies, many of which were created in response to recent legislation passed in Annapolis, specifically deters such proactive policing. Our office is committed to participating in community conversations where these solutions can be discussed. ASA DePietro did so not too many weeks ago. What became apparent is that law enforcement's hands are in many ways tied. There are certain investigative efforts, if they are ever identified and caught, that I'm not going to reveal here, but that we can use. But this is a community issue, and members of the community attended, made it clear that while they want harsher penalties, they understood the challenges of law enforcement. And the reality is that the penalties, we talked with Salisbury City Council people, the state penalties are adequate. It's simply the pursuit, the identification of offenders. The community members discussed solutions, and they wanted to engage with the youth to talk with them about the risks, and have vowed to do so in terms of education. My office will always participate in community outreach. We will do so through our participation in National Night Out, Junior Achievement, our summer camp, our prosecution for the public, and any other appropriate forum. We regularly go to schools to speak to students, to attempt to bridge gaps and build relationships that can make a difference. And these solutions are not all mutually exclusive of one another. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a particularly difficult issue, and I think Ms. Dykes has identified why that's so. And that is because while we want to enforce the law and these folks are a nuisance and a danger to themselves and others, we also don't want to initiate high-speed pursuits over dirt bike riding, right? And so we've got to find that happy balance. How do we address this issue without overkill, right? Hopefully not in the literal sense, which again leads to a lot of liability. I guess I would be hopeful that communication with young people would gain fruit, but I know I was pretty hard-headed when I was 16. I thought I was invincible, and I'm guessing most of these kids out there popping wheelies are of the same mindset. So I don't think that's going to be a big win. I really don't. Maybe we can, through City of Salisbury and other jurisdictions, license these dirt bikes, seek enforced bonding for folks who own dirt bikes, attach civil liability for those dirt bikes that are involved in any sort of accident or things of that sort. This is a stretch. It's not. There are no great ideas. If it were low-hanging fruit, it would have been done already. If it were easy, it would have been solved already. But I think there's certainly a way to, on the one hand, try to protect the right of folks who want to legally use dirt bikes and vehicles of that sort, and on the other hand, try to dissuade and discourage folks through civil forfeiture and things of that nature who use them and abuse them. So that would be my idea. Pursue licensing, bonding, and civil forfeiture actions.
Thank you, Mr. Britt. Okay, police officers, sheriff's deputies, troopers, other first responders are subject to on-the-job risk. Many other government employees, and even some private sector employees, are subject to similar levels of risk and danger. Please discuss concealed carry laws, school employee safety, possibly arming of some school staff and employees, hardening of schools, other state employees who may be at risk, and just describe your position on all of this. Mr. Britt, you're first, please.
That's a lot in 2 minutes, a lot to chew on. 3 minutes for that. Okay, say it, 3 minutes, my apologies. So, I think the first thing that I want to address is concealed carry permits. And I think we have seen in the law a kind of a giant shift over the last several days from the Supreme Court on who it is that qualifies for a concealed carry permit that is going to change the face of that in the state of Maryland. So we're going to shift from a may issue to a shall issue concealed carry permit state. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think that I'm a gun owner. I'm a supporter of the people's Second Amendment rights. You ought to have the right, if you are a law-abiding citizen, to defend yourself, to defend your family, and it ought not matter if you're in a special position or not. Now, I had a concealed carry permit before in my life when I was a district court commissioner. I had one when I was a prosecutor. I had one for a little while as a defense attorney. But it seemed like it was that position. As a commissioner, as a prosecutor, I was special, and MSP pushed it through. And then the average folks who I was friends with who didn't have those positions couldn't get it. I think thankfully the Supreme Court has shifted that right now, and I think that is a good thing ultimately, and will be a good thing and a beneficial thing. I think the ultimate goal ought to be to keep guns out of the hands of two people, criminals and the mentally ill. And for those of us who are law-abiding citizens, I think whether you are in Walmart or in a park, you have the right to defend yourself from whatever may present itself, and you have the right to defend the loved ones and strangers who are around you. In terms of hardening schools, I think any steps that we can take to make our schools safe, we ought to take those, because I'm a parent. I'm guessing most of the folks in this room are, and I can't imagine sending my child away to some school and not having them return to me at the end of the day. I can't fathom it. I cannot imagine it. Arming teachers is an idea that's bandied about. Whenever that comes up, I was thinking about the teachers that I've had throughout my life in grade school, high school, etc. And of those many teachers, I can think of maybe 4 who I would have trusted with a firearm, and the rest of them, I don't know that I would trust them with the chalk. But meaning no disrespect to teachers, but we all have our talents.
30 seconds.
There are many folks who I think probably are best not carrying a firearm, but that ought to be their decision. That ought to be the decision of the individual. So I guess if there's a takeaway, it's that law-abiding citizens should have the right to defend themselves, and we need to concentrate on getting the guns out of the hands of criminals and crazy people.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. The best protection against a bad guy is a good guy with a gun. That it's just simply the case. It's been proven time and time and time again. We need more trained law enforcement officers. We are, I think every agency operating in this county, there are 9 of them, are short on law enforcement officers. And until we value them, value their work, that is the best thing we can do for our schools, is more SROs. The sheriff and the Tunises are working on some hardening plans for our schools, and I am grateful for that. Responsible gun ownership, training, retraining, and education. That's what's going to keep responsible gun owners on the right side of the law, and I'm all for it. It will take much longer, I think, than any of us anticipate for the Supreme Court's ruling to impact our state, but it's coming. And I'm thankful that it is.
Number 9, discuss firearms laws, both federally and on the state level. We've already touched on this some, just in the last question.
Yeah.
But include in your discussion specifically red flag laws, the U.S. and Maryland constitutions, and of course reference the Supreme Court decision of last week.
Yeah,
is
it me or is it? I'm sorry.
Ms.
That's okay.
Dykes.
That's okay. It's okay. I'm the odds, you're the evens.
That's all good.
So I
don't
had to
think-
figure that out early on. The right to bear arms and defend one's health, one's home, and one's loved ones is a foundational element of our Constitution. It's almost in our genes as Americans. Second Amendment is not a second-class amendment. That's what the Supreme Court said. We are on the Eastern Shore. We are an outdoors culture, hunting, fishing, and that is worthy of respect and honor. Safety of all citizens is crucial and must also be respected and honored. And that's always at the forefront of our mind when I'm assigning felony cases and the number of illegal gun possessions that we have in Wicomico County. It is far, far, far too many. So we need to ask ourselves, and I think we can all probably settle on these. Do we want those convicted of violent crimes walking around with guns? Those peddling drugs to our children? Those who suffer from mental health concerns that impact their judgment with guns? Extreme risk protective orders are new. The red flag laws, we have only had occasion to use them rarely in Wicomico County. It's not required that law enforcement consult with me, but they do because they are so new and that they are complex. It is not an easy statute to get through. Law enforcement's preference is, whenever possible, is to have them approved by a judge before taking someone's weapons. It's not always possible, but we've had occasion in this county, of which I'm aware, less than a handful of times to be involved in those. Accountability is key to the public safety. Reasonable restrictions, reasonably applied, work for the benefit of all of us, so without unnecessarily impinging on our Second Amendment constitutional right.
Thank you. Mr. Brett?
Tonight, there's been clearly some disagreement, maybe even some tension between Ms. Dykes and myself on some things. This one, I don't think there's any real disagreement between us. I think that it's clear that we both have a very serious respect for those who have the right to defend themselves and their family. With respect to red flag laws generally, that is a large umbrella under which each state has their own kind of program set up. So I like the idea of it generally speaking, but of course, as with most things, the devil is in the details. And so I would want to make sure that we are respecting the due process rights of individuals so that we don't have somebody breaking down the door to an otherwise law-abiding citizen, taking their guns away, stripping them effectively of an important constitutional right. So I think it's important that they have their day in court, and if we go through that process, then I have no problem with red flag laws. I think that they are a great idea. I think they've been implemented very well in this locality. I saw one the other day in Worcester County, in the district court in Worcester County, and the judge was very respectful of this individual's rights, and everybody did what it is that they were supposed to do in that scenario. No right is absolute, right? The classic example is, despite your freedom of speech, you can't scream fire in a crowded auditorium, right? Your right to swing your fist ends at somebody else's face. So as long as we are respecting due process rights of gun owners, I think red flag laws are designed to protect us from those who are going through mental health crises, and I'm a proponent of that. So.
Thank you, Mr. Britt. Mr. Britt, last question from us is to you first. Our county is rife with crimes against two vulnerable groups, juveniles and the elderly. There are crimes of sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, financial abuse, and others. Discuss these crimes, including statute, and your position on prosecuting these crimes to the fullest. With regard to crimes against juveniles, how would you handle false accusations and reporting by the juveniles or other related parties? With regard to crimes against the elderly, focus on neglect and financial crimes and the lack of action by adult protective services or other agencies. Yeah, please.
So looking at juvenile issues first, juvenile is really difficult because it is set apart from the adult criminal justice system. And I think that is as it should be. We've already addressed at some point this evening that young people oftentimes make foolish decisions. But we should separate them between young kids who are acting like kids, right, doing foolish teenagery stuff like drinking beer, smoking marijuana, spray painting the school, right, things of that sort, and those who are endangering others, right? That's where we draw the line, or ought to draw the line. One of my concerns, and this goes back to one of the main issues that I have with respect to how the office has been run, the state's attorney's office has been run over the last 4 years, is we had, in the juvenile world, a prosecutor with 30 years of experience prosecuting juvenile offenses, and had been for a really, really long time. And he was one of the many that left the state's attorney's office because he didn't want to work under Ms. Dykes, is really the bottom line. And that is a loss. That is a loss. And in its place, since he left, we are, I think, now on our 4th juvenile prosecutor. Juvenile is its own special world, right? It has a language all its own that is different than the adult system. It has rules all of their own. And so the loss of that prosecutor, who's now prosecuting in Baltimore, it's sad. It's sad for me. With respect to elder abuse, I think the issues that we often see there that make it very difficult is it is often in a familial setting. That is, a sister is caring for an elderly parent and brother is not liking the job that's being done, or the brother believes that some abuse is occurring. And so when you get into those types of scenarios, it becomes extremely difficult to suss out the truth of what's going on. Is it really the financial package that grandma is sitting on that is at play here, or is there genuine abuse? Is there genuine neglect that is going on? And so I think that if we are able to establish certainly that there is genuine abuse and neglect, there's no call for that, right? Respecting our elderly is should be a backbone for our community, and allowing somebody to suffer in the twilight years in that sense is wrong and should be prosecuted absolutely to the fullest. That's all I got time for.
So I understood the question to be speak to juvenile and elderly victims. Both of those classes of victims tend to be victims of familial crime happening within the family. So what I'll say very briefly is that the length of time that a prosecutor spends in the position or has spent in a position does not equate to quality prosecution. It is just that simple, just that simple. Juvenile court, like district court, is a training ground and a starting place for young prosecutors, where they can dip their feet in prosecuting felony crime with the mentorship and leadership under an experienced juvenile prosecutor, of which we have two. The majority of my career, shifting to victims, the question, the majority of my career has been prosecuting violent crime against children. The proof issues are unique and specialized. That is why experience matters. I've prosecuted dozens upon dozens of child abuse cases. They are my passion, and we can make a true difference if we can get justice for victims. I have secured life sentences when the law and the court permitted us to do so. Our Child Advocacy Center investigates, prosecutes, and treats victims of child abuse and neglect. It's an incredible asset to our community that has existed for more than 20 years. There is a multidisciplinary approach that translates into effective prosecution, effectively holding offenders accountable and keeping potential victims safe. Senior Assistant State's Attorney Diane Karsnitz is assigned to our CAC and leads our Special Victims Unit. Diane has demonstrated incredible leadership, and her results at trial are unlike any other. Our investigators assigned to the CAC are trained and experienced at interviewing children and investigating these specialized types of crime. The question mentioned veracity, like false allegations. I have, in my 15 years, only encountered 2 cases that were charged that I later believed the victim, that the allegations were not as a victim said that they were, and I promptly dismissed those cases because that's what responsible prosecutors do. In my experience, I'm confident through the thorough investigations that happen at the CAC that most false allegations are never even presented to us. They are weeded out early. Elderly population, we have an Assistant State's Attorney assigned who is with our Special Victims Unit that is assigned to Adult Protective Services. Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
All right. So for those watching on PAC 14 or streaming, PAC 14 will rerun the entire forum several times because of technical difficulties at www.pac14, that's PAC14.org. Little announcement. We now have questions from the audience. We're going to limit these to 2-minute answers. I'm going to read the questions exactly as they were given to me. I think that some of the questions have already been answered, but we're going to do it anyway, just to give the audience their turn at participation. So, Ms. Dykes, how would your office handle a concealed carry case with the recent Scotus finding in New York? And I assume they mean in the New York decision, New York Rifle and Pistol Association.
The law in the state of Maryland hasn't changed, so there would be no change as it stands today.
Mr. Britt, you need me to repeat the question?
No, thank you. So I guess what I can say is obviously I don't have a prosecutorial decision to make at this point in time. That is up to Ms. Dykes and her office. But what I can say is back when I was with the state's attorney's office for 10 years, a lot of the crimes that I prosecuted were gun offenses. And a lot of times you'd see somebody go through the scales in Del Mar. They're from Georgia, trucker. They come through, state police officer says, hey, how you doing? You have any guns in the car? And they say, yeah, I've got my gun here. I've got my Georgia concealed carry permit. And the trooper says, thank you very much. You're under arrest. And that's wrong. That was just wrong. And I know Mr. Bruckner, who I see in here today, who handled a lot of those gun cases, and I scuttled those cases because we thought it was wrong. We dismissed those cases because we thought that it was more just to allow somebody to come through Maryland with no prior criminal history, who's trying to do it right, who's trying to be honest with law enforcement officers, to not strap that individual with a criminal record. That's just wrong. So that's what I did before. that's what I would do in the future.
Thank you, sir. The next question to you first, Mr. Britt. There have been examples of public investigations being slow-walked. How do you propose to work with a party that is not fully cooperative?
How do I anticipate working with a party that is not fully cooperative?
I'll read it one more time. Whoever wrote the question, if you choose to clarify, you're certainly welcome to do so. There have been examples of public investigations being slow-walked. How do you propose to work with a party that is not fully cooperative?
Well, I think one of the things that we do as trial attorneys a lot of times is we're dealing with uncooperative people, period. We're dealing with the best people on their worst day and the worst people on their worst day, right? So there's a lot of folks who don't want to be talking to police, don't want to be talking to prosecutors, period. So I think, you know, we have experience dealing with folks who do not wish to converse with us, and you try to work with those people as best you can towards the goal. And ultimately, if there's an investigation, we want to pursue justice with respect to the target of that investigation by allowing due process to work its way through, making sure that people are not slandered prior to the end of an investigation. But we also want to encourage folks to come forward and participate in that investigation. I don't know if that exactly hits on the question, but I hope so. If not, come see me later. I'll fill me in.
Do you need me to reread the question?
Sure, I'll try, yes.
There have been examples of public investigations being slow-walked. How do you propose to work with a party that is not fully cooperative?
Okay. So defendants don't have to cooperate, right? That's specifically like not their job. So the state has the obligation to prove its case based upon the admissible facts, and a defendant doesn't have to present any evidence, and this jury is specifically instructed that that cannot be held against them. I'm doing my best to fill in the holes as I don't quite fully understand the question. So the state meets its burden for witnesses that are uncooperative. There are ways that we can encourage their cooperation, but at the end of the day, those are limited in nature. We will, but again, it's experience and working with witnesses that are uncooperative that helps get us there. Our investigators and our victim witness coordinators are incredible at trying to bridge those gaps. So that's my answer, but I'm happy to elaborate with a little bit more information.
Next question. During the next session in Annapolis, if elected, will you advocate for stronger policies on punishments for violent offenders, especially with what happened to Deputy Hilliard?
We advocate in Annapolis, whether it's going to testifying virtually, or giving input through the MSAA. Violent offenders. The biggest concern that I have, and the biggest misconception that I think that the public has, is that there is truth in sentencing in Maryland. So it is not, right? If you're convicted of a nonviolent offense, you're eligible for parole in a quarter of the sentence. So people see drug crimes or sex offense convictions. Let's take, for example, the sex offender from the daycare, 126 years, not a crime of violence, eligible in less than 30 years. She is about 20 years old. She's going to be out by the time she's 50. So that I will absolutely advocate for stiffer penalties for violent crime, but part of the issue is the parole commission and how credit for good time is given and how release is determined. An offender for a violent crime, somebody gets life on a murder, they're eligible for parole in 15 years. Doesn't mean that they're going to get it, but they are eligible for parole in 15 years. So there's lots of room for improvement in the system generally, and I will certainly advocate for that.
Thank you. Mr. Britt?
Yeah, this is another one where there's not going to be a lot of daylight between us on this. Clearly, the answer is yes. We need to do more to stop violent crime and violent criminals. I think one of the things we can look to, and first of all, you got to realize what Annapolis is and what it isn't. We are in a bastion of conservatism here on the shore. Otherwise, it's kind of the People's Republic of Maryland a little bit that we're dealing with, and in Annapolis, and that's just an unfortunate reality. But I look to our sister state to the south, Virginia. Virginia did away with parole a decade and a half ago. It would seem like, couldn't we agree that for crimes of violence, they just aren't parole eligible? We're not going to get there. We're not going to get there with the folks in Annapolis, but should we advocate for that? Absolutely. Absolutely. For our nonviolent offenders, parole, second chances, I think we can find a place for them in society, but for violent offenders, for those who have broken that social contract with the rest of us in this civil society, no. No, I don't think they are deserving of parole, and if we can do anything to convince the folks in Annapolis of that, I would certainly love to see it.
Mr. Britt. Next question from our audience. Were either of you ever registered as a Democratic candidate? If so, why did you decide to change to the Republican Party? Mr. Britt, you're first.
Yeah, so I think I've been a registered Republican for the vast majority of my life. I also at some point registered as an independent, and I think I registered as a Democrat so I could vote in a primary election for governor, because there was a hot race on the Democratic side and there wasn't anything happening on the Republican side. But otherwise I've been I guess what I would say a Reagan Republican, a small government Republican for my entire life, and that's me.
I certainly didn't envision ever being in politics. And my grandfather was a registered Democrat, and I was for many years. However, when you take an inventory of your value system, and it became to matter because it was apparent that I needed to serve my community in the way that I am now, aligning my values with my affiliation was appropriate, and that's what I did. Thank you.
Next question from our audience. Who are your campaign contributors? Why are those people supporting you?
My campaign contributors are my friends, my family, victims that we've served, people from across this county. And they are my supporters because they know that I am the best state's attorney for this job.
So a lot of my campaign contributors, I don't know that I know who they are because I give that information to my treasurer because I don't know that it is fully appropriate for me to delve deep into that. I don't want somebody to say that I am in their pocket. I do know that I have a contributor who's here tonight, who's a friend of mine, also left the state's attorney's office and was sad to see what happened to Matt Massarello's crew. Those are the folks who are supporting me. I think the folks who have seen what it is like and has been like over the last 4 years.
Thank you, sir. Next question. What would you say the ultimate outcome was in the grievance against Kristen Ross?
The ultimate outcome.
Did you need me to repeat it?
No.
Thank you.
I'm pretty familiar with this. The ultimate outcome was nothing. The Attorney Grievance Commission took 10 minutes to discuss, asked Ms. Ross's counsel, where's Ms. Dykes? And there being no answer to that question, they dismissed it pretty darn quickly. I have my theories as to why that happened. I don't have any solid information, so I'm not going to speculate publicly about it. But what do we know for certain? We know that the complaint was unfounded because Ms. Dykes didn't bother to show up for the hearing.
So while Mr. Britt indicates that he's not going to speculate, certainly he's done a lot of that, and baselessly. So this is what I'll say is attorneys, all attorneys, when they have ethical obligations, they meet them. I did what my office, what I personally was obligated to do, and made the grievance. What happens to it afterwards, I'm not invested in. There was a ream of paper sent detailing Ms. Ross's, the allegations against Ms. Ross. I was in constant contact with the Attorney Grievance Counsel, Michael Blow. He specifically, I spoke to him on 2 occasions, he specifically said there is no need for you to appear. No need whatsoever. So baseless speculation as to that is offensive, and certainly there's history of other baseless claims made. The Attorney Grievance Commission, I met my obligation. Quite frankly, I'm addressing it now only in response to Mr. Britt's claims and Ms. Ross being his treasurer. But otherwise, I don't even think any of us are supposed to be talking about it. It is a private matter.
Ma'am, excuse me.
I've met my obligation. I did what I was supposed to do. The rest of the system took its process, and I was told specifically on 2 occasions that I did not need to appear.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from the audience. With sex offenders, they have different tiers and requirements on those tiers. How can you make sure all home visits and requirements are being followed by both the offender and police officer?
Will you repeat the question?
I will. Exactly, I will. Yes, ma'am. With sex offenders, they have different tiers and requirements on those tiers. How can you make sure home visits and requirements are being followed by both the offender and police officer?
Okay. It is true that sex offenders are 3 tiers, and that there are certain requirements along with probation conditions, and then you have supervision requirements in addition to the registration requirements. The person who usually takes lead on that is parole and probation. So it's not the police officer. Certainly as to the registration piece, police officers sort of check in on that. We are active in the sex offender management team. It's called COMET, Collaborative Offender Management, something. So where we all sit around a table every month to discuss every sex offender who is supervised and registered within Wicomico County. There we have been tipped off to concerns and been able to intervene in cases based upon those meetings that happen behind the scenes. Again, like offender compliance, police officer or probation agent compliance, we have incredible sex offender agents. I will tell you that Matt Kushwa was a former one, and Heather Hall is currently, and they're incredible agents. So I have no concerns that, and I've heard no concerns that those expectations are not being met.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Britt, did you want me to read the question?
No, thank you. I think this is one that Ms. Dykes is exactly right. The question requires a little bit of education. I think Ms. Dykes has provided that it is a probation agent. Once an individual is sentenced to a sentence that involves sex offense registration, they then go to the Division of Parole and Probation that has primary responsibility at that point in time. And I think the go-to person is Heather Hall. I do know, what I can say is that agency is an agency that is under stress, that often has some issues in staffing. So there is some concern. I have some concern that they don't have enough bodies to do the work that need to be done to keep track of these individuals. So certainly in my role as state's attorney, I would advocate for additional funding for those individuals, but it is primarily that agency at that point in time who is responsible for supervising registered sex offenders.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last question from our audience. What is your opinion on the new laws set to take effect July 1st for law enforcement officers? And how do you see it affecting law enforcement and the state's attorney's office in Wicomico County?
Yeah.
Sir, you're up.
Yeah, this is a tough time to be a police officer. It's never been an easy job to begin with. I come from a law enforcement family. I kind of have that that within me, that desire for public service in that field, in that realm. And now the legislature has seen fit to make it even tougher, as if the last half dozen years or so, the abuse and turmoil that they have suffered, we're making it tough for cops to be cops. And I think that's sad. As a citizen of this county, this state, I think that's sad. And ultimately, I think it's dangerous. Now, again, we're fighting kind of against the surf, holding back the waves when we're dealing with the folks in Annapolis on issues of this and many, many others. But I think it is important that we have a state's attorney who is going to back up law enforcement officers, who is going to, when the rubber meets the road, have their back, right? Have their trust, maintain communication with them. And that's what I would seek to do.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am?
Yes. The new legislation is clear as mud. Specifically, the legislature and the Office of the Attorney General have not defined what necessary and proportional means. It has created unsettled and I would say fear among law enforcement. So we are working with them. We are creating a memo and a roll call training to go out and try to meet their concerns. The reality is, it is a stark and unfortunate reality, but until an appellate court speaks to that issue, until an appellate court defines necessary and proportional, we are all guessing. And that means that a law enforcement officer has to be prosecuted and convicted in order for an appellate court to, so I pray that is not a Wicomico County case. The challenges that Annapolis, specifically the legislature, has made for us is incredibly unfortunate. It is not my job. It is not the state's attorney's job to protect law enforcement. We will continue, as we always have, to have good relationships, to bridge gaps, but in order to ensure integrity in, thank you, in this position, and for the public to have confidence, that cannot be our go-to. We will do what we can. We will respect the work that they do. But if there is fault to be had, it will be what it is. So.
Thank you. There were a couple more questions. My fellow moderators, thank you, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Hobbs. Going through the questions, we kind of had to make sure that anything that might not come out as appropriate or may be considered inflammatory or biased towards one candidate or the other. Unfortunately, we appreciate your questions, but my guys kicked them out. And I apologize if one of those was one of your questions. It's in the interest of a good, fair debate. Now for the closing comments by our two candidates. Since you went first at the beginning with the opening remarks, Mr. Britt, would you please go first with your closing remarks?
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, at the time, give the candidate the opportunity to go over as well.
Well, first I want to thank you all for having us out here tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming out and listening to us, the folks who are going to be watching this, either maybe watching it live on PAC 14 or watching it later after the technical difficulties have been smoothed out. It shows that there are people in this community who are invested and people who care. We live in a great country, and we have folks up here who disagree on a number of things, and yet we are able to talk about it civilly. We're able to debate it and discuss it. We're not hitting each other over the head. We're not attacking each other. We are doing what the American dream ought to be with respect to our body politic. We are discussing the issues. We are discussing the differences, and we are pointing out what we want to do with the state's attorney's office. What I want to do, I want to have those line officers who feel abandoned, who feel that the communication has broken down, and I want to build them back up. I want to build those lines of communication back up. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Go out tonight, go to the police officers, go to the road officers, and ask them. Ask them, right? What are they seeing? What are they dealing with? And I think what you're going to find is that they have a lot of trouble trusting the state's attorney's office right now, trusting the guidance that they're getting from it when they're able to get any guidance at all. I'm going to rebuild the communication so that when an officer is involved in a case, there are pretrial conferences. Those pretrial conferences, by and large, aren't taking place right now. Now, are some attorneys doing them? Absolutely. Are some officers showing up for them? Absolutely. But all too often, I'm hearing from officers whose cases are being resolved without any input, whose cases are, they're getting thrown up on the witness stand without any trial prep in the way that it used to be when I was in the state's attorney's office, where we'd bring them in, sit them down, talk through the questions, especially the rookie officers, the young officers. So that is my hope, is to rebuild those lines of trust, rebuild those lines of communication. For the state's attorney staff, we need to stop the revolving door of attorneys coming and going, right? There was an attorney who left, I think, just 4 weeks ago. She'd only been here about 6 months. It's continuing on. It's continuing on. And when that happens, the caseload doesn't disappear, it just gets spread out. And when the caseload gets spread out, the attorneys get spread thin. And that's unfortunate because it just adds to stress, it adds to anxiety, and then you have that many more people who are looking for a greener pasture, any greener pasture, because they can't stay in that environment anymore. I'm also going to increase the discretion among the attorney staff. One of the issues that I've heard repeatedly is that the attorneys don't have the authority to make decisions. Everything's got to be run up the flagpole. Everything's got to be by committee. And when you're, again, standing on the side of the road with legal issue presented to you at 2 in the morning, you don't have time for committee. You don't. The people who pick up the phone, they have to have the authority and discretion to make decisions. And again, that's not what I'm hearing from the police who I interact with all the time. From the police who are saying, I grew up with Jamie, I love her. Man, it's a hot mess over there. Help us out. That's what I want to do. That's what I'm going to do. And I hope that come July 19th, I have your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for your interest in the state's attorney's race and taking the time to be here and listen at home on PAC 14. I appreciate this opportunity. I have high standards. I expect members of my office to work towards and achieve the highest ethical standards. That is non-negotiable, non-negotiable. My competitor and Ms. Ross are no longer at the office of the state's attorney for Wicomico County because there was no meeting of the minds as to ethical standards. Whenever there is a change in executive leadership, there will be turnover. It's natural and expected, quite frankly. Before I made changes, I watched, I listened, I attempted to bridge gaps. I didn't make rash decisions. I didn't make significant or immediate changes, as some state's attorneys have. Not that there is anything wrong with that, because that is in their election to do. That just was not my style. I'm not aware of a profession at this moment that isn't struggling to find qualified staff. We are no exception. I'm grateful for the county executive and the county council for agreeing and increasing ASA salaries by 15% to bring us up to standard. 15%. 2 ASAs left to be sworn in as judges. Some left because they found opportunities better suited for them and their families, whether it was more money, less hours. Our work is hard. It takes courage. It takes commitment. It is not for the faint of heart. And change is hard. It's obvious that Mr. Britt is still reeling over his departure. My intention has only ever to been meeting our ethical standards and giving this community what it deserves: safety and confidence in its criminal justice system. I am the person prepared to lead this team. I have the trial experience. I have done the work. I have led the people doing the hard work. And objectively, by all measurable standards, we have proven our success. And not one of my prosecutors complains about the work they do, because it is a calling, because it is their purpose. When I took office, one of the first things I did was create a trial team structure. Had a team leader for violent crimes, special victim crimes, guns, drugs, and gangs, and district court. Experienced senior assistant state's attorneys led and mentored their teammates, and elevating the service that we provide to this community. I have staffed those teams with an eye towards assigning prosecutors with expertise and aptitudes best suited for the crimes that they're prosecuting. And they have met and exceeded the highest ethical standards. All team leaders have 15 years or more experience. Are members of the National District Attorneys Association, continuously receive training updates and information on cutting-edge developments in our field. We focus on training for all prosecutors. Each new ASA attends Baby Prosecutor School put on by the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. We all attend the MSA Summer Conference for developments and news specific to Maryland. And in fact, ASA Bourdon, who is also a certified fraud examiner, I don't know of another certified fraud examiner that prosecutes in the state, is attending homicide training in Chicago as we speak.
30 seconds.
I've assigned liaison to all law enforcement agencies. Well, since I'm short on time, I'm going to talk about my people. Trish Coletta, 19 years experienced. I submit to you the most experienced wiretap prosecutor in the state now that Tony Julia has retired from Baltimore City. Diane Carstens, we've already talked about her. Scott Messersmith, former naval flight officer who hunted Soviet subs all over the world, has been practicing criminal law for more than 22 years. He leads our violent crime team. Angie DiPietro, 25 years experience, leading our district court unit. Patrick Gilbert, 10 years of experience, most of that as an assistant public defender. He leads our prosecution integrity unit. He's well-dressed and well-read. Is that my time? Darn it. Okay. Thank you all for your interest and for coming tonight. I will have handouts in the hallway, and we'll stay after for questions or specific concerns that you have.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank all of you for coming, because without you, what good would it be to have this forum? Thanks to folks that are watching on PAC 14. Thank you to PAC 14 for being with us tonight in general. Thank you so much to Delmarva Conservative Movement, because all of you participated in putting this together. Thank you so much. Sir, good luck.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ma'am, good luck.
Thank you.
This concludes our forum, and again, thanks for coming.